The morning suns rose over Valanthar and cast twin shadows across the crystal towers that had stood for 10,000 years, and Maya walked along the highest bridge watching her dragons practice their flight patterns in the violet sky. And she felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the last guardian of her people. Ember swooped down first, and her crimson scales caught the light like liquid fire, and she chirped happily as she landed on Maya's outstretched arm, and the young dragon was still small enough to perch there, though she grew larger each passing season, and Maya smiled at her companion's enthusiasm, because Ember always brought joy, even on the darkest days. Shadowfang circled higher, and his massive form blocked out one of the suns, and his obsidian scales seemed to drink the light itself, and he was the eldest of her 3 dragons, and the most protective. And Maya could feel his unease through their bond, because something approached from beyond. The sky and his instincts warned of danger. The 3rd dragon Whisper glided on silent wings, and her silver-blue scales shimmered like moonlight on water, and she was the smallest, but also the wisest. And she landed beside Maya without a sound and pressed her snout gently against Maya's cheek in a gesture of comfort that said she too sensed the coming change. Maya had dreamed of this day for many cycles, and her visions showed ships falling from the stars, and beings unlike any her world had known, and the elders had warned her that when the humans came everything would transform, and she would face a choice that would determine the fate of her entire species. She descended from the tower using the ancient wind steps, and her feet barely touched the crystal stairs as she moved with grace her people had perfected over millennia, and her long silver hair flowed behind her like a river of starlight, and her eyes held the deep purple color of her world's sky at dusk. The warning bells began to ring from the outer towers, and Maya's heart quickened, because the bells had not sounded in 3 generations, and they only rang when something breached the atmospheric barrier, and her dragons responded immediately with Shadowfang releasing a roar that echoed across the valley and shook the very foundations of the ancient city. She reached the council chamber where the other elves gathered in worry and fear, and they looked to her for guidance because she was their guardian and their protector, and the bond she shared with her dragons made her the strongest among them, and also the loneliest, because great power always came with great isolation. Urtheron spoke first, and his voice trembled with age and concern, and he told Maya that the sensors detected a single vessel approaching, and it bore the markings of humanity, and the stories of human expansion had reached even their distant world, and none of those stories ended well for the civilizations they encountered. Maya felt her dragon's emotions flowing through their bond, and Ember's curiosity, mixed with Whisper's caution, and Shadowfang's aggressive protectiveness, and she calmed them with gentle thoughts, because panic would serve no purpose, and she needed to assess this threat with clarity and wisdom. She told the council that she would meet this vessel alone, and that her dragons would accompany her, but the other elves would remain safe within the city's shields. And Elder Theron protested, saying it was too dangerous, but Maya silenced him with a look that reminded everyone present that she had faced dangers beyond imagination and survived them all. The human ship broke through the clouds like a silver needle, and it moved with purpose toward the valley below, and Maya positioned herself on the highest peak where she would be clearly visible, and she wanted the humans to see exactly what awaited them, and to understand that this world had a protector who would not yield easily. Shadowfang landed behind her with enough force to crack the stone beneath his claws, and Ember took position on her left, while Whisper circled overhead, and together they created an image of power that should have made any invader reconsider their approach. And yet the human ship continued its descent without hesitation. Maya reached deep within herself and touched the wellspring of power that made her different from other elves, and she felt her final form stirring like a sleeping giant. And it whispered promises of destruction and victory, and she knew that if she released it, the human ship would be nothing but vapor and scattered atoms. But something made her hesitate, and perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was the dream she had the previous night, where she saw not destruction but understanding, and a future where her people walked among the stars alongside others, and the dream had felt more real than any vision she had experienced before. The ship landed with surprising gentleness, and its engines quieted, and a ramp extended to touch the purple grass of her world, and Maya tensed as a single figure emerged, and her dragons growled in unison, ready to strike at her command, and she raised her hand to hold them back because she wanted to see what manner of being would dare to face her alone. The human walked forward without weapons drawn and without the aggressive posture of a conqueror, and this surprised Maya because every hostile species she had encountered always led, with threats and shows of force, and yet this human approached with hands visible and pace measured and respectful. She studied him carefully and noted the way he moved with confidence but not arrogance, and how his eyes swept across the landscape, with wonder rather than calculation. And when he looked up at her standing on the peak with 3 dragons at her command, his expression showed no fear, but rather something that looked almost like hope. Maya made her decision then, and she leaped from the peak and let the wind catch her, and her descent was graceful and controlled, and she landed 20 paces from the human, and her dragons followed and formed a protective triangle around her, and Shadowfang's hot breath washed over the human like a warning. The human stopped and slowly reached up to remove his helmet, and Maya saw his face clearly for the first time, and he appeared young by human standards, but his eyes held depths that suggested he had seen much in his short life, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the space between them with steady clarity. He introduced himself as Lucas Gray and said he came in peace, and Maya almost laughed at the ancient phrase that meant nothing when backed by weapons capable of destroying worlds. But she sensed no deception in his words, and this intrigued her more than any threat could have. She responded with her own name and told him that peace was a word that required action to give it meaning, and that she had heard promises from many species before, and all of them had proven false. And Lucas nodded as though he expected this response, and he asked permission to explain why he came alone to face a being who could destroy him with a thought. Maya granted him this chance because wisdom taught that understanding an enemy was as important as defeating them, and she commanded her dragons to hold their positions, and she waited to hear what this human would say that might convince her not to unleash her final form and end humanity's expansion into her corner of the galaxy before it could truly begin. Lucas stood before Maya and her dragons, and he took a deep breath before speaking, and his words came from a place of honesty that surprised even himself, and he told her about Earth and how humanity had almost destroyed their own world through greed and ignorance and warfare that nearly turned their planet into a lifeless rock floating in space. He described cities burning and oceans dying, and the moment when humanity stood on the edge of extinction and looked into the abyss they had created, and he spoke of the generation that chose differently and decided that survival meant changing everything about how they saw themselves and their place in the universe. Maya listened and watched his face for signs of deception, and her dragons remained tense but curious, and Ember tilted her head as she studied Lucas with intelligent eyes, and Whisper descended lower, circling just above them, as though she too wanted to hear his story more clearly. Lucas continued and explained that humanity learned from their mistakes in the hardest way possible, and they carried scars from their past, both physical and emotional, and those scars taught them humility that longer-lived species might never understand, because they never faced the immediate threat of self-destruction. He told Maya that humans now explored the stars not to conquer but to learn, and to find their place among the countless civilizations scattered across the galaxy. And yes, they had made mistakes in their expansion, and yes, some human groups still acted with aggression and ignorance, but the majority genuinely sought understanding and cooperation. Maya felt Shadowfang's doubt through their bond, and the great dragon rumbled deep in his chest because he had protected Maya through countless encounters with species who claimed peaceful intentions, and every one of them eventually revealed darker motives, and she shared his skepticism. But something about Lucas made her continue listening. She interrupted Lucas and asked him why he came alone and why his people sent a single ship to her world instead of a fleet. And Lucas smiled sadly and said that he volunteered for this mission because he believed that first contact required vulnerability and trust, and that arriving with a fleet would only prove humanity had learned nothing from their past. Maya narrowed her eyes and told him that vulnerability could also be a tactic, and that appearing weak might simply be a way to lower her defenses. And Lucas acknowledged this with a nod and said she was right to be suspicious, and that trust had to be earned through actions, not words. He reached slowly into his armor, and Maya's dragons immediately tensed, ready to strike, and Shadowfang moved forward, with fangs bared, but Lucas kept his movements careful and deliberate, and he pulled out a small data device and held it toward Maya. The device contained everything Lucas said, and it held humanity's complete history, both the glorious moments and the shameful ones, and it showed the wars and the recovery and the debates among human leadership about how to approach new species, and it was unfiltered and unedited and completely honest. Maya took the device and her fingers brushed against Lucas's hand, and she felt a spark of something she could not name. And she wondered if this human truly believed his people could be different, or if he was simply a skilled diplomat who knew exactly what to say. She activated the device, and images flooded her mind, and she saw Earth burning and then healing, and she saw humans arguing passionately about their future, and she saw the ships leaving for the stars with hope rather than conquest in their hearts, and she saw the failures and the successes, and the ongoing struggle to be better than what they had been. Whisper landed beside Maya, and the silver-blue dragon touched her snout to Maya's shoulder in a gesture of support, and Maya felt her companion's wisdom flowing through their bond. And Whisper seemed to suggest that perhaps this human spoke truth, and that judging an entire species by their worst moments was no different than others judging elves by their most destructive guardians. Lucas waited patiently while Maya reviewed the information, and he showed no signs of nervousness or impatience, and he simply stood in the presence of beings who could end his life instantly, and he appeared at peace with whatever decision Maya would make. Maya finally looked up from the device, and she studied Lucas with new understanding, and she asked him what humanity wanted from her world, and Lucas answered that they wanted only permission to study and learn, and perhaps to establish a small research station that would allow cultural exchange. She laughed then, and the sound was bitter and sharp, and she told Lucas that every species started with small requests and research stations, and then they expanded and claimed more territory, and soon the native population found themselves strangers on their own world. Lucas did not argue, and instead he asked Maya what proof she would accept and what humanity could do to demonstrate their sincerity, and Maya was struck by this response because no one had ever asked her that question before, and she realized she had no answer prepared. Shadowfang growled and suggested through their bond that Maya simply destroy the human and his ship and be done with it, and that trusting outsiders always led to betrayal and pain, and Maya understood his perspective because he had been with her the longest and had witnessed every species that tried to exploit their world. But Ember chirped softly, and the young dragon's emotions carried curiosity and hope, and she wondered if perhaps this human was different and if maybe they could learn from each other, and Maya felt torn between Shadowfang's caution and Ember's optimism. Whisper sent calming thoughts through the bond and reminded Maya that wisdom meant considering all possibilities, and that closing their world off from the universe entirely was its own kind of death, and that life required risk and growth even when growth brought danger. Maya made her decision, and she told Lucas that she would test humanity's intentions, and that she would allow him to stay on her world for one lunar cycle, and during that time he would live among her people and learn their ways, and if at the end of that cycle he proved trustworthy, then they would discuss further cooperation. Lucas's face showed surprise and gratitude, and he bowed deeply in a gesture of respect that seemed genuine, and he thanked Maya for this opportunity, and promised that he would honor her trust and work tirelessly to prove that humanity deserved a place among the peaceful species of the galaxy. Maya warned him that her dragons would watch his every move, and that any sign of deception or aggression would result in immediate consequences, and that her final form remained ready to be unleashed if he betrayed her, and Lucas acknowledged this with solemnity, and said he expected nothing less. She turned to lead Lucas toward the city, and her dragons followed with Shadowfang watching the human with intense suspicion, and Ember bouncing excitedly at the prospect of a new friend, and Whisper gliding silently overhead as she observed everything with her careful wisdom. As they walked, Maya wondered if she had made the right choice, and if this human would prove different from all the others, or if she had simply delayed the inevitable conflict. And she touched the power within her, and felt her final form waiting, and she knew that if Lucas betrayed her trust, the consequences would be absolute and final. Lucas walked beside Maya, and he looked at the crystal towers rising before them, and his expression showed wonder and respect, and he asked questions about her people and their history, and Maya found herself answering because his curiosity seemed genuine, and his interest appeared sincere. The city gates opened as they approached, and the other elves watched from windows and doorways, and their faces showed fear and distrust. And Maya understood their feelings because she shared them, but she also knew that isolation was slowly killing their civilization, and that perhaps humanity offered a chance for renewal. Elder Theron met them at the central plaza, and his ancient face showed disapproval and concern, and he asked Maya if she truly intended to allow this human into their sacred city, and Maya told him that she did, and that change was coming, whether they welcomed it or feared it. Lucas greeted Elder Theron with respect and humility, and he asked permission to learn from the elves and to share human knowledge in return. And Theron studied him with eyes that had witnessed 5,000 years of history, and finally nodded, though his expression remained guarded. Maya showed Lucas to quarters in one of the outer towers and told him that he would begin learning their language and customs the next day, and that her dragons would remain close at all times, and Lucas accepted these conditions without complaint, and he thanked her again for this chance. As Maya left Lucas's quarters, Ember followed her, and the young dragons sent feelings of excitement through their bond, and Maya smiled despite her worries because Ember's enthusiasm was infectious. And perhaps the young dragon was right to hope for something better than endless isolation and suspicion. Night fell over Valanthar, and Maya stood on her tower watching the stars and wondering what the next lunar cycle would bring, and whether Lucas would prove to be humanity's best representative or its most clever deceiver, and she knew that only time would reveal the truth. The first week passed slowly, and Lucas spent his days learning the Elven language and studying their customs, and he approached every lesson with genuine interest and respect, and Maya watched him carefully, looking for any sign that his kindness was merely an act designed to lower their defenses. Ember took to Lucas immediately, and the young dragon followed him everywhere, and she chirped happily when he greeted her each morning, and Lucas learned to scratch behind her ear ridges in just the right way that made her practically purr with contentment, and Maya found this both amusing and concerning. Shadowfang maintained his distance, and the great obsidian dragon refused to let Lucas approach, and he watched the human with unblinking eyes that promised swift death if any threat emerged, and Maya appreciated his vigilance because someone needed to remain suspicious, when even she found herself warming to their guest. Whisper observed Lucas with her usual careful wisdom, and she circled overhead during his daily walks through the city, and sometimes she would land nearby and study him with her intelligent silver eyes, and Maya sensed that Whisper was forming her own opinion about humanity through this single representative. Lucas proved to be a quick learner, and within days he could speak basic phrases in the Elven tongue, and he made mistakes that caused the children to giggle. But he laughed along with them, and his willingness to look foolish endeared him to many of the younger elves who had never met an outsider before. Elder Theron remained skeptical, and he cornered Maya one evening and told her that Lucas's charm was precisely what made him dangerous, and that the most effective deceivers were always those who seemed most trustworthy. And Maya acknowledged his wisdom, but said that fear of deception should not prevent all possibility of genuine connection. The turning point came during the second week when a group of young elves ventured too far into the wild forests beyond the city walls, and they encountered a razorback beast that had wandered down from the northern mountains, and the creature was territorial and aggressive, and the children's screams echoed across the valley. Maya responded immediately, and her dragons took flight, and she raced toward the forest using her enhanced speed. And when she arrived, she found Lucas already there, and he had positioned himself between the children and the beast, and his small human weapon seemed laughable against the razorback's armored hide. The beast charged, and Lucas fired his weapon, and the shots barely slowed the creature, and Maya prepared to unleash her power. But then Lucas did something unexpected, and he threw his weapon aside and charged directly at the beast, and he slid beneath its armored body and struck at the vulnerable joint where leg met torso. The razorback roared in pain and turned on Lucas, and Maya saw that he had bought enough time for the children to escape. And she realized he was willing to die to protect elven younglings he barely knew, and something shifted in her heart at that moment. Shadowfang arrived first, and he slammed into the razorback with the force of a falling mountain, and his massive jaws closed around the beast's neck, and the fight ended quickly and brutally. and Lucas lay on the ground breathing hard and bleeding from several deep cuts. Maya knelt beside him and her hands glowed with healing energy, and she pressed them against his wounds, and she felt the strange warmth of human blood and the rapid beating of his mortal heart. And she worked quickly to seal the injuries, while Lucas watched her with eyes that held gratitude and something deeper. The children gathered around them, and their fear had transformed into awe, and they touched Lucas gently and thanked him in their small voices, and their parents arrived moments later, and they looked at the human with new understanding, because he had risked his life for their offspring, without hesitation. Lucas recovered quickly thanks to Maya's healing, and he insisted on walking back to the city rather than being carried, and when they arrived, word of his actions had already spread, and the elves who had regarded him with suspicion now looked at him with respect and curiosity. That evening, Elder Theron came to Maya, and his expression was softer than she had seen in years, and he told her that perhaps she had been right to give humanity a chance, and that actions spoke louder than any promises, and that Lucas had proven himself in the way that mattered most. Maya visited Lucas in his quarters that night, and she brought fresh bandages and healing herbs, and she found him sitting by the window looking out at the stars, and he seemed peaceful despite the pain that must still linger from his wounds. She asked him why he had thrown himself at the Razorback when his weapon had proven useless, and when retreat would have been the logical choice, and Lucas was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth. He told her that humanity had learned hard lessons about the value of life, and that their near extinction had taught them that every being mattered, and that protecting the innocent was not a choice but a duty, and that he could not have lived with himself if he had allowed those children to die when he might have saved them. Maya sat beside him, and for the first time since his arrival, she allowed herself to truly see him not as a potential threat but as an individual who carried his own scars and hopes and fears, and she told him about her final form and what it meant, and what it could do. She described the transformation and how her body would become living energy, and how her power would multiply 1,000-fold, and how she could reshape reality itself in a small radius, and how every being she had ever used it against had been erased from existence. Lucas listened, and his face showed understanding, rather than fear, and he asked if she carried the weight of those deaths, and Maya was surprised by the question because few beings ever considered the cost that such power demanded from its wielder. She admitted that yes, she carried every death, and that her final form was both her greatest strength and her deepest burden, and that she had vowed to use it only when no other option remained, and that the thought of unleashing it again filled her with dread, even as she knew she would do. So without hesitation, if her people were threatened, Lucas reached out slowly and took her hand, and the gesture was gentle and carried no demand or expectation, and he told her that bearing such responsibility alone must be incredibly lonely, and Maya felt something break inside her because no one had ever acknowledged the isolation that came with being the guardian. Tears fell from her eyes, and she was not ashamed because elves did not hide their emotions as some species did, and Lucas simply sat with her while she cried, and he offered no empty platitudes or uncomfortable attempts to fix her pain, and his presence alone was enough. When her tears subsided, Maya told Lucas something she had never shared with anyone, and she confessed that sometimes she feared her final form more than any external threat, and that she worried one day she might lose control and become the very thing she fought against. Lucas squeezed her hand gently and said that having that fear was what made her worthy of such power, and that those who never questioned themselves were far more dangerous than those who constantly examined their own hearts. And Maya found unexpected comfort in his words. They sat together in silence for a long time and watched the twin moons rise over Valanthar, and Maya realized that somewhere in the past 2 weeks Lucas had stopped being a human representative and had become simply Lucas, and she was no longer just assessing humanity, but had begun to care about this individual person. The next morning, Maya made a decision, and she called a council meeting and announced that Lucas had proven himself trustworthy, and that she would allow humanity to establish a small research station on the outskirts of their territory, and that cultural exchange between their species would begin formally. Elder Theron supported her decision, and the other council members agreed, though some remained cautious and Maya understood their hesitation, but she also knew that growth required risk, and that her people had been stagnant for too long. Lucas received the news with quiet joy, and he immediately sent word to his ship which had remained in orbit waiting for his signal, and he assured Maya that the research team would be carefully selected, and that they would respect elven customs and territory. As preparations began, Maya spent more time with Lucas, and they walked through the city together, and he continued learning about her culture while sharing stories of Earth and humanity. And her dragons accepted his presence with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Ember adored him completely, and Whisper approved of him cautiously, and even Shadowfang grudgingly tolerated his existence. And Maya found herself imagining a future where elves and humans worked together, and where her world was not quite so isolated. But deep in her heart she knew challenges remained, and that not all humans would be like Lucas, and that her final form might yet be needed. And she wondered what would happen if humanity betrayed her trust, and if she would have the strength to unleash destruction on beings who wore Lucas's face. The human research station took shape over the following weeks, and Lucas's team arrived in small groups, and each member went through a careful introduction process. And Maya interviewed every single person who set foot on her world, and she made it clear that Lucas's sacrifice had earned humanity this chance, but that chance could be revoked instantly. Most of the human researchers approached their work with genuine respect and curiosity, and they studied elven architecture and language and customs, and they shared their own knowledge freely, and Maya watched as her people slowly began to open up to these strange visitors from across the stars. But not all humans proved as worthy as Lucas, and a researcher named Kevin brought trouble. When he attempted to take samples from one of the sacred crystal formations without permission, and Shadowfang caught him in the act, and the great dragon's roar shook the entire valley. Maya arrived to find Kevin pressed against the crystal wall, with Shadowfang's fangs inches from his throat, and the human was babbling apologies and claiming he did not understand the significance of what he was doing. And Maya felt her rage building because ignorance was no excuse for disrespect. Lucas appeared, moments later, and his face showed shame and anger. And he pulled Kevin away from Shadowfang, and he spoke in harsh tones that made the other researcher flinch, and Maya understood enough of the human language to know that Lucas was threatening severe consequences. She stopped Lucas with a raised hand, and she told him that this was her world and her justice. And Lucas nodded and stepped back, though his expression showed he wanted to personally throw Kevin off the planet. Maya turned to Kevin, and her eyes glowed with inner power, and she told him that he had one chance to explain himself and that she would know if he lied. And Kevin stammered that he was only trying to gather data and that he meant no harm. She saw the truth in his words, but also the deeper problem, and Kevin genuinely had not intended disrespect, but he also had not bothered to learn what was sacred and what was forbidden. And his ignorance came from laziness rather than malice, and that made it almost worse. Maya made her judgment, and she told Kevin that he was banished from her world and that he would return to his ship immediately and never set foot on Valanthar again. And she told Lucas that humanity needed to do better in selecting who they sent, and that incompetence was as dangerous as malice. Lucas accepted her decision without argument, and he personally escorted Kevin back to the ship, and when he returned, his face showed exhaustion and disappointment, and Maya understood that he felt responsible for Kevin's actions, and she told him that he could not control every human, just as she could not control every elf. The incident caused tension between the elves and humans, and some of Maya's people called for ending the exchange entirely, and they said that Kevin's disrespect proved humanity could not be trusted, and that Lucas was an exception rather than the rule. Elder Theron supported Maya's more measured approach, and he pointed out that elven history contained many examples of individuals who acted foolishly without representing their entire species, and that judging humanity by one researcher's mistake would be hypocritical. Maya spent the next several days rebuilding trust, and she worked with Lucas to establish clearer guidelines and protocols, and they created a comprehensive guide for human researchers that outlined sacred spaces and forbidden actions and consequences for violations. During this time, Maya noticed Lucas growing more tired and withdrawn, and she finally confronted him one evening and asked what troubled him beyond Kevin's mistake. and Lucas hesitated before admitting that he feared he had built something fragile that could shatter at any moment. He told Maya that he believed deeply in the possibility of human-elven cooperation, but that he also knew humanity's capacity for selfishness and cruelty, and that every day he worried that another incident would destroy everything. They had worked to build. Maya understood his fear because she shared it, and she told him about her recurring nightmare where she unleashed her final form against human ships, and how in the dream she could see Lucas's face among the dying, and how she woke up shaking and unable to return to sleep. They sat together on Maya's tower, and Ember curled up beside them and provided warmth in the cool evening air, and Whisper perched nearby, and Shadowfang maintained his vigil from a higher spire, and the dragon's presence reminded Maya that she was never truly alone. Lucas asked Maya to tell him more about her final form, and she was surprised by the request because most beings avoided discussing things that frightened them, but Lucas seemed to want to understand rather than simply fear. She tried to explain the transformation, and how her body dissolved into pure energy, and how her consciousness expanded to encompass everything within range, and how she could feel every atom and manipulate reality at the quantum level. She told him that time moved differently in that state, and that seconds stretched into eternities, and that she experienced every death she caused with absolute clarity, and that the power was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Lucas listened carefully, and then he asked the question that no one else had ever thought to ask, and he wondered if her final form hurt her, and Maya was struck silent, because yes, it hurt terribly, and the transformation felt like dying and being reborn, and the power burned through her like fire. She admitted that using her final form caused damage that took weeks to heal, and that each transformation left scars on her soul that never fully faded, and that she feared one day she would transform and simply not be able to return to her normal state. Lucas looked at her with compassion and understanding, and he told her that humanity had learned that the strongest people were often those who sacrificed the most, and that her willingness to endure such pain for her people made her worthy of their devotion. Maya felt tears threaten again, and she marveled at how this human could see through her defenses and touch parts of her heart that she kept hidden from everyone else, and she wondered if this was what connection truly meant. Weeks continued, and the research station became an established part of the landscape, and human and elven children began playing together despite their differences, and Maya watched as friendships formed that would have been impossible just months ago. She spent more time with Lucas, and their conversations ranged from serious discussions about interspecies relations to silly debates about which world had better food, and Maya found herself laughing more than she had in centuries. Ember appointed herself Lucas's unofficial guardian, and the young dragon followed him everywhere, and she had learned several human words, and she would chirp them randomly, much to everyone's amusement, and Lucas treated her with the same affection he might show a beloved pet, though Maya knew Ember was far more intelligent than any animal. Even Shadowfang began to tolerate Lucas's presence, and the great dragon no longer growled when Lucas approached, and once Maya saw Shadowfang allow Lucas to touch his scales, which was an honor the dragon granted to very few. Whisper spent long hours observing the human research station, and she seemed fascinated by human behavior, and sometimes she would land among the researchers and allow them to approach her, and Maya sensed that Whisper was conducting her own study of humanity. Then came the day that changed everything, and a distress signal reached the research station from a human colony 3 systems away, and the message spoke of an attack by unknown forces and desperate pleas for help. Lucas immediately wanted to respond, but the research station had only small ships designed for study, not combat, and Maya saw the conflict in his face because every instinct told him to help his people, but logic said he could do nothing. She made her decision in an instant, and she told Lucas that she would help and that her dragons could carry them through space using the ancient paths that elves had traveled before humanity learned to walk upright. Lucas protested and said he could not ask her to risk herself for human problems, but Maya silenced him with a look, and she told him that if their peoples were to be true allies, then they must stand together in danger, as well as peace. Elder Theron argued against her decision, and he said that human conflicts were not elven concerns, but Maya stood firm, and she pointed out that the colony included children, and that turning away from those in need was not the elven way regardless of species. She gathered her dragons and explained what she needed. And Shadowfang agreed immediately because battle was what he understood best, and Ember was eager to help, though Maya worried about bringing the young dragon into danger, and Whisper accepted her role with calm wisdom. Lucas organized a small team of humans who would accompany them, and they gathered weapons and supplies, and Maya saw the determination in their faces, and she understood that humanity might be flawed, but they possessed courage that was admirable. As they prepared to leave, Maya pulled Lucas aside and she told him that if the situation required it, she would use her final form, and that he needed to understand what that meant, and Lucas nodded and said he trusted her judgment. She looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her heart race, and she realized that somewhere along the way, her feelings for Lucas had deepened beyond friendship and respect, and she wondered if he felt the same, or if she was simply projecting her own loneliness onto the first being who truly understood her. The journey through the ancient paths took only hours, though normal space travel would have required days, and Maya's dragons moved through dimensions that humans barely understood, and she felt the familiar pull of the void and the strange timelessness that came with traveling between the stars in the old way. They emerged above the human colony world and immediately saw the situation was dire, and 3 massive warships orbited the planet, and they bore markings of the Krell Dominion, and Maya knew the Krell as ruthless conquerors who took what they wanted and destroyed anything that resisted. Lucas's face went pale when he saw the Krell ships, and he explained that humanity had encountered the Krell before, and that every meeting had ended in bloodshed, and that the Dominion viewed younger species as resources to be exploited or eliminated. Maya assessed the tactical situation and saw that the colony had shields, but they were failing, and that Krell landing forces were already on the surface, and she made quick decisions about how to proceed, and she divided their small force to address multiple threats simultaneously. Shadowfang would engage the warships directly, and his size and power made him a match for their weapons, and Whisper would use her speed to evacuate colonists to safe zones, while Ember would provide air support against the Krell ground forces, and Maya and Lucas would lead the human team to reinforce the colony's defense. The battle began immediately, and Shadowfang roared his challenge as he dove toward the nearest warship, and his obsidian scales deflected their initial weapons fire, and he tore into their hull with claws that could rend metal like paper, and explosions bloomed across the ship's surface. Whisper moved like silver lightning, and she swooped down to the colony and grabbed groups of civilians in her gentle claws, and she carried them to underground shelters that the Krell had not yet reached, and her precision and care saved hundreds of lives in the first minutes. Ember unleashed streams of fire against the Krell ground troops, and her crimson scales blazed like a second sun, and she drove the invaders back from the colony's outer walls, and her youth made her fearless, in a way that both inspired Maya and terrified her. Maya and Lucas landed with their team near the colony's command center, and they found the human defenders exhausted and running low on ammunition, and the Krell were pressing their advantage with brutal efficiency. Lucas immediately took charge of organizing the defense, and his military training showed as he directed forces to weak points and coordinated fire patterns, and Maya saw a different side of him then, and understood that he was not just a diplomat but a warrior when circumstances demanded. She moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, and her elven speed and strength made her nearly untouchable, and she struck down Krell soldiers with precision and mercy because she took no joy in killing but understood necessity. The Krell commander noticed her and recognized what she was, and his forces redirected their attention toward Maya, because the Krell knew about elven guardians, and they understood that eliminating her would break the colonists' resistance. Maya found herself surrounded by Krell-heavy troops, and their weapons were designed to bring down beings far stronger than humans, and she felt several shots penetrate her defenses, and pain bloomed across her body. Lucas saw her danger, and he charged toward her position despite the suicidal nature of such an action, and he fired his weapon continuously and drew Krell attention away from Maya, and she felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with her wounds. She used the moment Lucas created and broke through the Krell encirclement, and she reached his side, and they fought back to back, and their movements synchronized without need for words, and Maya understood that battle revealed truths that normal life kept hidden. Shadowfang destroyed the first warship, and it broke apart in orbit, and debris rained down in controlled patterns that avoided the colony, and he moved to engage the second ship, but took heavy fire, and Maya felt his pain through their bond and knew he could not hold much longer. The Krell commander made his final move, and he brought his flagship into lower orbit and activated weapons that could glass the entire colony. And Maya saw the energy building and knew they had only seconds before everything was destroyed. She looked at Lucas and their eyes met, and understanding passed between them without words, and she told him through their connection that she would stop the Krell, but that he needed to get everyone to safety. And Lucas started to protest, but Maya silenced him with a gesture. She kissed him then, and poured everything she felt into that single moment. And Lucas held her tightly, and told her that she could not sacrifice herself, and Maya smiled sadly and said that this was what Guardians did, and that some things were worth dying for. Lucas held her face in his hands, and his voice broke as he spoke, and he said the words she had never expected to hear. And he told her that no one survives your final form, but that he would die loving her, if that was what the universe demanded. Maya felt tears on her cheeks, and she realized they were his tears, not hers, and she told Lucas that she loved him too, and that meeting him had taught her that even ancient beings could learn new ways to live, and she promised to return if she could. She pushed him away gently but firmly, and she rose into the air and called her dragons to her, and Shadowfang and Ember and Whisper gathered close, and she told them she loved them and asked them to protect Lucas when she was gone. The transformation began, and Maya felt her body dissolving into pure energy, and the pain was worse than she remembered, and every cell screamed in protest, but she pushed through because the alternative was watching everyone she cared about die. Her consciousness expanded, and she perceived the entire battlefield and every life in danger, and the massive energy weapon charging on the Krell flagship, and she understood the physics of it and knew exactly how to stop it. Her final form manifested fully, and she became a being of living light that blazed like a star, and her power reached out and touched the Krell weapon, and she rewrote its structure at the quantum level and turned its energy back on itself. The flagship's weapon exploded, and the detonation consumed the ship and its crew, and Maya felt every death as though it were her own, and the weight of those souls pressed against her consciousness, and she struggled to maintain her sense of self. She turned her attention to the remaining Krell forces, and she did not want to kill more but knew they would not retreat. And so she restructured the battlefield and created barriers of solid energy that trapped the Krell without harming them and gave the colonists time to capture or contain them. Her power blazed for what felt like hours but was actually only minutes, and she reshaped reality to protect life rather than destroy it, and when she finally released her final form, she felt her consciousness compressing back into her physical body. The pain of reformation was excruciating, and Maya fell from the sky, and she expected to die because every guardian before her who used their final form this extensively had perished from the strain, but then she felt familiar claws catch her gently. Shadowfang held her and lowered her to the ground, and Lucas was there immediately, and his hands pressed against her wounds, and she heard him calling for medical help, and his voice sounded like it came from very far away. She tried to speak, but her body would not respond, and she felt herself slipping away, and she wondered if loving Lucas had been worth this price, and decided that, yes, it absolutely had been. Even if these were her final moments. Ember and Whisper pressed close, and their combined warmth flowed into her, and Maya realized her dragons were sharing their life force to keep her alive, and tears fell from her eyes, because she did not deserve such devotion. Lucas held her through the night while human and elven medics worked frantically to save her, and he whispered words of love and hope and promise, and Maya clung to his voice like an anchor that kept her from drifting into the void. 3 days later, Maya opened her eyes and found herself in a human medical facility, and Lucas was asleep in a chair beside her bed, and his hand still held hers, and she saw exhaustion and worry etched into his face. She squeezed his hand weakly, and Lucas woke immediately, and his expression transformed from worry to overwhelming relief, and he kissed her forehead and her cheeks and her lips, and told her that she had terrified him, and that she was never allowed to almost die again. Maya laughed weakly and told him she would try her best, and Lucas told her about the aftermath, and how her actions had saved not just the colony, but created an opportunity for peace with the Krell, because witnessing power used mercifully rather than vengefully had affected even their brutal culture. The colony celebrated her as a hero, and the human government offered formal alliance with her people, and Elder Theron sent word that the elves were proud and that perhaps it was time for their civilization to step back into the wider galaxy. Maya recovered slowly, and Lucas never left her side, and her dragons took turns keeping watch, and Ember especially seemed determined to remain close, as though afraid Maya might disappear if she looked away. When Maya was finally strong enough to walk, Lucas took her to the observation deck and they looked out at the stars together, and he asked her what came next, and Maya told him she did not know but that she wanted to face it with him beside her.